In 1979, a family of four drove home during a violent storm, and they were never seen again. For nearly 3 decades, their disappearance was blamed on the weather, until the lake they vanished beside was drained, and a rusted car appeared from the mud. What was inside that car changed everything the town thought it knew, and revealed a truth darker than the storm itself. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. In the summer of 1979, a storm rolled across the small town of Clearwater, drenching the streets with rain and flooding the narrow roads that wound around the nearby reservoir. That night, Thomas Hale loaded his wife Margaret and their 2 children, Anna, who was 16, and little Jacob, who was only 8, into the family station wagon after a late church picnic. The storm had grown worse, but Thomas insisted on getting everyone home before it became impossible to drive. Neighbors remembered seeing the headlights of the wagon heading toward the highway near the lake, but the family never arrived. When morning came, the Hale house was still dark. No one had returned during the night. Concerned relatives went looking, and soon the whole town joined the search. Police dragged sections of the reservoir, and volunteers spread out through the woods, muddy fields, and back roads. Nothing was found. Not a tire track, not a piece of clothing, not even a scrap of metal from the car. The Hales seemed to have vanished into thin air. Some said the storm swept them into the lake where the currents pulled them under. Others whispered that Thomas had made enemies in town, and maybe the storm wasn't the real reason they disappeared. As weeks turned into months, the case grew colder. The missing posters faded on telephone poles, and the sheriff finally admitted there were no more leads. Still, the story stayed alive in Clearwater. Parents warned their children not to drive near the reservoir at night, and old-timers lowered their voices whenever the Hale family was mentioned. For many, the unanswered questions became part of the town's folklore, an eerie reminder of the storm that had taken 4 lives without a trace. Nearly 3 decades later, in the spring of 2008, the old dam near Clearwater needed repairs. The reservoir was drained slowly, leaving behind cracked earth and wide stretches of thick mud where water had once been. As the water line sank lower, workers noticed something sticking out near the broken remains of a dock. At first, it looked like nothing more than a mound of rusted metal, but when the mud was cleared away, the shape became clear. It was a station wagon, its doors shut, windows smeared with dirt, and its frame twisted with age. The car had been waiting at the bottom of the lake for 29 long years, and inside it lay the first real clue to what happened to the Hale family. The discovery of the rusted station wagon spread through Clearwater faster than wildfire. People gathered along the edge of the drained reservoir, whispering in shock as the police moved in to secure the area. For the older folks who remembered that terrible summer of 1979, it felt like a ghost had returned to town. Reporters from nearby counties crowded the muddy banks, snapping pictures of the half-buried car. When the vehicle was finally pulled from the mud, the truth inside began to unfold. In the front seat, investigators found 2 skeletons, one in the driver's seat and the other in the passenger side. The remains were fragile and tangled in torn clothing, but police quickly assumed it was Thomas and Margaret. Their children, Anna and Jacob, were nowhere to be found. The back seat was empty. In the glove compartment, an old leather-bound notebook was recovered, surprisingly well preserved in a waterproof pouch. Officers flipped through the stained pages and found entries written by Thomas in the weeks before the storm. His handwriting was hurried, almost anxious, as he described problems at the church where he served on the finance committee. He wrote of missing money, unexplained withdrawals, and his fear that some of the men he trusted were involved in something dishonest. His final note ended with an unsettling line: "If anything happens to us, it will not be the storm." The discovery changed everything. What had once seemed like a tragic accident now pointed toward something far darker. If Thomas and Margaret had died trapped in the car, then where were Anna and Jacob? And who had Thomas been so afraid of in his final days? The drained lake had answered one question, but opened the door to many more. The town of Clearwater stirred with unease as word spread that only 2 of the Hales had been found. For the first time in nearly 30 years, the the sheriff's office reopened the case, treating it not as an accident, but as a possible crime. Detectives went over the station wagon inch by inch. The driver's doors showed dents that didn't match storm damage, almost as if it had been struck before it went into the water. A shard of glass from a different vehicle's headlight was found lodged in the mud near the bumper, raising more questions than answers. Meanwhile, Thomas's notebook caused quiet ripples among those who remembered the late 1970s in Clearwater. Old townsfolk muttered that the church treasurer back then, a man named Harold Briggs, had lived far beyond his means. Others recalled that another leader, Reverend Cole, had suddenly taken an extended trip out of state just months after the Hale family vanished. Both men had returned to their respected positions with no suspicion at the time, but now the diary cast a shadow on their names. For Ethan Hale, the only surviving child who had been away at summer camp during that fateful storm, the phone call about the car's discovery hit like a bolt of lightning. He had spent nearly 3 decades haunted by survivor's guilt, believing his family was lost to the storm. Now he was being told there may have been more to the story, that his parents might have been silenced because of what they knew. He packed a small bag and returned to Clearwater for the first time in years, determined to learn what really happened to his family and to finally face the ghosts of the storm. When Ethan arrived back in Clearwater, the town felt smaller than he remembered. The streets where he once rode his bike seemed worn down, the houses older, and the air heavy with memories. He parked outside the old Hale house, which had long since been sold to another family. The shutters were peeling, and the porch sagged under the weight of time. For a moment, Ethan just sat in his car, staring at the place where he once laughed with his sister Anna and played ball with Jacob in the yard. It was as if the ghosts of his childhood hovered in every corner, waiting for him to return. The sheriff's office greeted him formally, though most of the officers were too young to remember the original case. Only Sheriff Raymond, now retired but still sharp, carried the weight of 1979 on his shoulders. He met Ethan at the station and offered a handshake that lingered too long. "I never forgot what happened to your family," Raymond said quietly, avoiding his eyes. "But back then the storm was all anyone could see. It swallowed the truth." His words gave Ethan no comfort, only a deeper suspicion that something had been buried, not just the car, but the facts themselves. Ethan was shown the evidence room where his father's notebook lay sealed in a plastic sleeve. He sat down and read the pages carefully, tracing his father's desperate handwriting with trembling fingers. The entries grew darker toward the end. Thomas had written about missing church funds, quiet meetings that turned tense, and his belief that men he once trusted were preparing to silence him. The last entry stopped mid-sentence, as though he had been interrupted. Ethan's throat tightened as he read the words over and over. "If anything happens, the ones closest to us will know why." After leaving the station, Ethan drove out to the reservoir. The sight of the drained lake unsettled him. The cracked earth, the dried fish skeletons, the smell of mud that had been hidden for decades. At the center stood the rusted wagon, surrounded by yellow police tape and guarded by an officer. The vehicle looked like a tomb, the once shiny metal now broken and fragile. Standing there, Ethan imagined his parents fighting for breath, trapped in rising water, while Anna and Jacob were taken somewhere else. His chest ached at the thought, but his mind burned hotter with questions. Why were the children missing? Who had forced the car into the lake? And why had no one spoken up in nearly 30 years? As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the dried lake bed, Ethan realized he was not just back in Clearwater to mourn. He was here to dig, to uncover secrets that had been left to rot in the dark. And judging by the way the old sheriff avoided his eyes, there were people in this town who never wanted the truth to rise. That evening, Ethan decided to walk through the center of town. Clearwater had not changed much since the late 70s. The same diner with its squeaky screen door sat on Main Street, still run by the same family. The drugstore was there too, though its sign was faded and one of the letters hung crooked. People looked at Ethan with cautious curiosity as he passed. Some recognized him immediately, the boy who had lost his whole family in the storm. Others whispered and lowered their eyes, as though the tragedy was something they weren't allowed to speak of too loudly. He stopped at the diner for coffee, hoping to gather his thoughts. But as soon as he stepped inside, Silence swept across the room. At a booth near the window, an older man lifted his head. It was Harold Briggs, once the church treasurer, his frame thinner now, his face lined with age. He stared at Ethan for a long moment before looking away. A few tables over sat Reverend Cole, the pastor who had led the church during the late 70s. He was white-haired now, but still carried himself with authority. Both men had been named in his father's notebook. Both had been part of the last place Thomas Hale was known to be alive before that night. Ethan ordered his coffee and sat at the counter. The waitress, a kind woman named Linda, who had known his mother, leaned close. "I heard about the car," she said softly, almost in a whisper. "It stirred up things best left alone." She slid the mug in front of him. "People here don't forget, Ethan. They just don't speak." Her words clung to him as he sipped the bitter coffee, his eyes flicking back to the booth where Harold and Reverend Cole now spoke in hushed voices. Their heads leaned close together, their expressions tight. As Ethan left the diner, Harold's gaze followed him through the window, sharp and watchful. The air outside felt colder, though the night was mild. He walked toward the motel where he was staying, the streets quiet except for the hum of an old neon sign flickering above a hardware store. But when he stepped into his room, his heart dropped. The door was unlocked. On the small wooden desk, his father's notebook, which he had left sealed in its sleeve from the sheriff's office, was now lying open. The last page was missing, torn clean out. Ethan froze. He checked the drawers, the bathroom, even the closet, but the room was empty. Whoever had been there was gone. But the message was clear. Someone still wanted the truth buried. The notebook had survived 3 decades under mud and water. Yet in a single night back in Clearwater, a piece of it had been stolen. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, his fists tight, the weight of old fear pressing down on him. He now knew for certain that what killed his family was not just the storm. Someone in town had been waiting for this moment, and they were already one step ahead of him. Sleep never came easy that night. Ethan lay awake in the dim glow of the motel's flickering lamp, the sound of passing trucks on the highway drifting through the thin walls. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured his father's notebook with the last page ripped away, imagined someone's hands pulling it out while he was gone, someone who still feared the truth after almost 3 decades. By morning, his determination had hardened. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start. The old Mount Olive church stood at the edge of town, its wooden steeple leaning slightly after years of storms and neglect. Ethan hadn't stepped foot inside since the funeral service held for his family, a service without bodies to bury. Now, as he pushed open the heavy doors, the smell of polish and candle wax filled the air. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, painting the pews in dull colors. At the front, standing near the pulpit, was Reverend Cole. He was older, slower, but his presence filled the room the same way it had all those years ago. "Ethan Hale," the Reverend said, his voice gravelly but steady. "I wondered if you'd come." His expression was practiced, part sympathy, part warning. It must be painful to see this place again. Ethan's reply was firm. "I'm not here for comfort. I want to know what my father was writing about before he died. His notes mention missing money. They mention you." The Reverend's eyes narrowed, and for the first time his composure cracked. Thomas was a good man, but he had suspicions. Sometimes suspicion turns into obsession. Storms take lives, Ethan, not secrets. But Ethan wasn't convinced. He noticed the Reverend's hand tremble as he gripped the pulpit, his knuckles pale. Before he could press further, the sound of footsteps echoed in the sanctuary. Harold Briggs entered, his face drawn tight, his voice sharp. "This isn't the place for old ghosts, Ethan. Your father was a fine man, but dragging up the past will only tear this town apart. Let what's buried stay buried." The word sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Let what's buried stay buried. It was too pointed, too heavy with meaning. He glanced toward Harold's jacket and caught a faint smear of fresh mud on the hem of his sleeve, as though he had been somewhere he shouldn't have. Ethan said nothing, but his mind raced. Later that afternoon, he visited the reservoir site again. The police were still combing through the mud, bagging fragments from the car. An officer showed him something new, A small shoe, worn but intact, pulled from the silt just yards from where the station wagon had been found. It was Anna's size. Ethan felt the air drain from his lungs. If the children hadn't drowned in the car with their parents, then where had they gone? And why was one child's shoe left behind, while no trace of the other remained? That night, Ethan drove past the cemetery out of habit, as if pulled there by unseen hands. Under the pale moonlight, he noticed two silhouettes moving among the graves near the church's far fence. They carried shovels. His breath caught as he recognized them. Reverend Cole and Harold Briggs. They were digging, their movements hurried and uneasy. Ethan shut off his headlights and parked in the shadows. For the first time, the suspicion in his father's notebook no longer felt like scribbled fears. It felt like a warning, and he was now standing at the edge of the same danger that had swallowed his family 30 years ago. Ethan sat in the dark, his hands clenched around the steering wheel, watching the two men work in the cemetery. Their shovels cut into the earth with a steady rhythm, breaking the silence of the night. The longer he watched, the more certain he became that this was not some innocent act of caretaking. They weren't planting flowers or tending graves. They were digging something up. Every so often, the beam of a lantern they carried caught their faces, and the expressions he saw were not of calm church leaders, but of men carrying heavy fear. He forced himself to stay still, though every instinct told him to confront them. Instead, he took out his phone, trying to capture a blurry photo through the windshield. But before he could focus, Harold stopped digging and glanced around the graveyard. For a moment, Ethan thought he had been spotted. He sank low in his seat, his heart thudding so loud he feared it might echo. Harold muttered something to Cole, and they both leaned into the hole they had made. When they straightened, Harold was carrying a bag, dark, heavy, covered in soil. Cole looked toward the road, and Ethan ducked further down, holding his breath until their heads turned back toward the grave. After several tense minutes, the men loaded the bag into Harold's truck, shoved the shovels into the bed, and drove away down a back road that led out toward the forest. Ethan started his engine and kept his headlights off, trailing far enough behind to avoid detection. The narrow road twisted through the trees, the truck's taillights glowing faintly ahead like red eyes in the dark. They drove nearly 20 minutes before stopping at a clearing near the edge of a cliff that overlooked the river below. Ethan parked at a distance and moved closer on foot, crouching behind a tree. He could see them arguing now, their voices carrying through the still night. Cole's words cut sharp. "It should have stayed buried. If someone finds this, we're finished." Harold's reply was colder. "We've carried this weight too long. It ends tonight." Harold hoisted the bag and staggered toward the cliff's edge. Ethan's breath caught when the bag tore slightly on the road. Rocks, and from the opening fell a small, rotted book, its leather cover cracked but still recognizable. Even in the dim light, Ethan knew what it was. The missing 1977 sermon journal that had vanished from his father's study. The book his father had written in during the very months before the storm. The book that could contain the truth. Ethan couldn't hold back any longer. He stepped from the shadows. "Drop it," he shouted, his voice rough with anger. Both men spun around, startled, their faces pale. Cole stepped forward, his hands raised as if to calm him. "Ethan, you don't understand. Some things are better left in the past." But Ethan's eyes were fixed on the torn bag, where he now saw something else glinting in the lantern light. Small fragments of bone, pieces that could not be mistaken for anything else. His stomach turned cold. This wasn't just about stolen money or missing records. This was about bodies. About Anna and Jacob. Harold's hands tightened around the bag as he stepped closer to the cliff. "Your father couldn't stay quiet," Harold said, his voice shaking with something between anger and guilt. "And neither could the children." The world seemed to tilt around Ethan. His father's last words in the notebook, the storm, the missing children, all of it slammed into place. He realized, with a sickening clarity, that what he was witnessing was not the end of the story, but the continuation of a cover-up that had begun 30 years ago. And now, standing in the dark, with two men who had already proven what they were capable of, Ethan understood he might not leave the forest alive. The night air hung heavy as Ethan faced the two men near the cliff. His heart pounded, but his voice stayed steady. "That bag doesn't belong to you," he said. "Whatever is inside, my father's words, my brother, my sister, it ends tonight." His words echoed off the rocks and seemed to linger in the trees. Harold's face twisted with panic, while Reverend Cole's expression was one of grim resignation. The older pastor raised his hand as if to calm the moment. "Ethan, listen to me. You don't know what you're standing in the middle of. Your father, he found out about things he was never meant to know. It wasn't supposed to go this far." Ethan took a step forward, his eyes locked on the half-opened bag. "So you buried them? You silenced him, and then you silenced the children?" "Why?" His voice broke slightly, anger and grief fighting inside him. Harold snapped, his voice shaking but loud. "Because your father wouldn't keep quiet. He threatened to stand before the congregation, to ruin everything, to expose us. He thought he was righteous, but he was tearing down men who had given their lives to this church. And when the storm came that night, it gave us the chance to fix it. Nobody questioned a storm." The words struck Ethan like a blow. He saw it now. The storm had been a cover, gift of chaos that let men do something unthinkable. His family's disappearance had never been an accident of nature, but a crime buried under water in silence. He moved closer, his hands trembling, but his voice sharp. "Where are Anna and Jacob? What did you do to them?" Harold looked away, his jaw tightening. Cole shifted uneasily, his eyes wet with something that looked almost like shame. After a pause, the Reverend whispered, "They saw too much. They were just children, but Harold. He said they would grow and speak. He made me help." Ethan felt his knees weaken. The thought of his little brother and sister, terrified, taken from the car, silenced before they ever had a chance to grow, was more than he could bear. The rage inside him roared, but before he could act, Harold suddenly swung the bag toward the cliff, trying to heave it into the river below. Ethan lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the torn leather. The three men collided in a struggle, the lantern tipping and throwing wild shadows across the rocks. The bag split further, spilling fragments onto the ground. Bones rolled across the dirt, along with the cracked cover of his father's missing journal. Ethan's hand closed around it, just as Harold shoved him backward. He staggered, his foot skidding near the cliff edge. "Enough!" Ethan shouted, holding the journal close to his chest. "This isn't staying buried anymore. My father's words survived 30 years under mud and water. The truth will survive you." The sound of sirens broke through the chaos. Red and blue lights flickered in the trees above the clearing. Sheriff's deputies, alerted by Ethan's earlier call before he followed the men, were closing in fast. Cole's face drained of color. Harold cursed under his breath, his grip on the bag loosening as the weight of years of secrets finally bore down. For the first time, Ethan saw fear in their eyes. Not of him, but of the truth that had finally caught up to them. And in that moment, standing between his family's killers and the approaching officers, Ethan knew the storm's silence was finally breaking. The clearing erupted with noise as sheriff's deputies poured in, their flashlights cutting through the night, beams darting across the cliffside. The sound of boots on gravel and shouted commands filled the air. "Drop the bag! Hands where we can see them!" The deputies' voices were firm, practiced, leaving no room for hesitation. Harold froze, his chest heaving, sweat glistening on his forehead in the lantern's dying glow. His hands twitched toward the bag of bones as though torn between letting go and finishing what he had started. Reverend Cole, pale and trembling, slowly raised his hands. His eyes darted toward Ethan, and for the first time, Ethan saw no authority, no pride, just a broken old man haunted by what he had done. Ethan stayed back, clutching his father's journal to his chest. He couldn't look away from the family's scattered remains on the ground, small fragments that once belonged to his siblings, the very pieces Harold had tried to throw into the river. His stomach churned, bile rising, but he forced himself to stand tall. This was the moment his father had been denied 30 years ago. The truth was about to speak, louder than the storm ever had. Deputies swarmed, wresting the bag from Harold's grip. He fought wildly at first, spitting out curses, yelling that they couldn't prove anything. His voice cracked into near madness. "They'll never believe you. They'll say it was the storm." His words echoed off the rocks, desperate and wild. But the sight of the bones spilling onto the dirt betrayed him, every fragment screaming louder than his denial. Cole, meanwhile, collapsed to his knees, his hands still raised. He spoke in a hoarse whisper, not to the deputies but to Ethan. I begged him not to. I told him the children should be spared, but I was too weak. I was too afraid to defy him. God help me, I let it happen. His voice trembled, carrying both confession and cowardice. Ethan's eyes burned, not with pity but with fury. Weakness had stolen his family as surely as Harold's cruelty had. The deputies pulled Harold to his feet, clamping cold steel cuffs around his wrists. Cole didn't resist. He allowed himself to be lifted by two officers, his shoulders sagging under decades of guilt. Ethan remained rooted to the ground, his mind reeling, his heart caught between anguish and grim relief. He had imagined this night countless times in sleepless hours over the years, dreaming of justice, fearing he'd never get it. Now that it was here, it didn't feel clean. Justice was stained with the truth of what his brother and sister endured. As the flashing lights painted the clearing in red and blue, Ethan crouched and gathered the scattered fragments gently into his hands. His chest ached as he whispered, I found you. You're coming home now. For the first time since the storm of 1979, he allowed himself to cry. Not the angry tears of a boy left behind, but the broken sobs of a man finally touching the pieces of what was stolen. The deputies carefully collected the evidence, sealing every fragment and the journal into protective bags. One officer, her voice calm and steady, touched Ethan's shoulder. We'll do this right. Your family will finally be given the truth they deserve. Ethan nodded, his throat too tight to answer. He knew this was only the beginning. Courtrooms, confessions, and the reopening of wounds long scarred. But as Harold Briggs was shoved into the back of a patrol car, and Reverend Cole followed quietly behind, Ethan realized the silence of Clearwater had ended forever. For the first time in 30 years, the town's secrets were out in the open, and the storm that once covered everything could no longer protect the guilty. The night was heavy, the grief unbearable, but Ethan felt something, unfamiliar stir inside him. A small, fragile sense of peace, because the truth, no matter how dark, had finally risen. By the next morning, Clearwater buzzed like it hadn't in decades. News vans lined Main Street, their antennas stretching into the gray sky while reporters swarmed outside the sheriff's office, shoving microphones toward anyone willing to talk. The discovery of the Hale family car and the shocking arrests of Reverend Cole and Harold Briggs had shaken the town to its core. For years, people had whispered about the storm, about the mystery of that vanished family, but never in their darkest imaginations had they pictured two of Clearwater's most trusted men tied to it. Ethan walked through the crowd with a hollow expression. He had never wanted cameras, never asked for headlines, but here he was, his family's tragedy turned into front-page news. Some townsfolk reached out, patting him on the shoulder, offering condolences mixed with guilt. Many had sat in Reverend Cole's pews. Many had trusted Harold with their money, their secrets, their lives. And many had doubted Thomas Hale all those years ago when he tried to raise concerns. Inside the station, detectives worked tirelessly to log the evidence pulled from the clearing. His father's missing journal was carefully dried and preserved. Technicians flipped through its fragile pages, and even though some ink had blurred, key entries were clear. Thomas had written names. He had recorded exact amounts of missing funds from church accounts, pointing directly to Harold and Cole. His words, firm and unshaken, told of his decision to confront them before the congregation the very Sunday after the storm struck. That confrontation never came. Cole, under questioning, admitted what Ethan already suspected, that Thomas had been lured to the church office that night. A fight had broken out when Thomas threatened to go public. Margaret, who had come looking for her husband, was caught in the struggle. The storm outside masked the sounds, the lightning and thunder, covering the violence within those walls. And then, in panic and rage, Harold had made a decision no one could take back. The most devastating confession, however, came when Cole broke down and spoke of Anna and Jacob. His voice cracked, and for the first time in decades, tears rolled down the man's face. He described the children hiding in the hallway of the church, watching what happened, their terrified eyes giving away that they had seen everything. Cole claimed he begged Harold to let them go, but Harold insisted they would grow up to tell. That night they were taken. Their bodies were never placed in the car with their parents. Instead, they were buried in a shallow grave near the churchyard, moved years later, when Harold feared construction might expose them. That was the bag they had been trying to throw into the river when Ethan caught them. Ethan listened to these details from across the table, his fists tightening with every word. It wasn't the storm, it wasn't fate, it was fear and greed and betrayal wrapped up in the robes of men who had called themselves servants of God. The storm had been nothing more than their cover. When the questioning ended, the sheriff handed Ethan a folder containing photographs of the evidence, the journal, the fragments, and the old station wagon. Ethan took them silently, his throat locked. He knew the road ahead would be long, the trials, the endless retelling of how his family had been destroyed. But as he walked out of the sheriff's office into the glare of cameras, he held the folder tightly against his chest. The world finally knew what Clearwater had tried to forget. The storm in 1979 hadn't taken his family. Men had. And now, after nearly 30 years, the silence was breaking, and the guilty would have nowhere left to hide. The following week in Clearwater felt like an old wound torn open, bleeding into every corner of town. People filled the pews of Mount Olive Church, not for worship but to whisper in hushed voices, pointing at the pulpit where Reverend Cole had once thundered about forgiveness and salvation. Now the same pulpit stood empty, its varnished wood seeming darker under the weight of shame. The church bell rang on Sunday, not to call worshipers, but to remind them that everything they believed about their leaders had been turned inside out. Ethan walked through the church doors one afternoon, accompanied by Detective Warren, the lead investigator now assigned to handle the case. The place was unchanged, the same stained glass windows with fading saints, the same wooden pews polished smooth by decades of hands and knees. For Ethan, it was like stepping into a memory he had buried with his family. His father's steady voice leading hymns, his mother's gentle smile as she passed hymnals down the row, Anna scribbling drawings in the margins of bulletins, and Jacob whispering questions he wasn't supposed to during prayers. Now the silence inside pressed hard, broken only by the creak of the detective's boots on the wooden floor. "This is where it started," Ethan murmured, staring at the small office door off to the side of the pulpit. "My father came here that night, thinking he could make things right. He didn't walk out." Detective Warren nodded grimly. "We'll have forensics sweep the office, though after 30 years, evidence will be slim. But Cole's confession gives us enough to tie the events here to what was found at the lake." He paused. "Are you ready to see it?" Ethan nodded, and together they stepped into the cramped office. Dust floated in the sunlight that filtered through a cracked blind. A heavy wooden desk sat in the corner, its surface scarred with scratches, and against the wall was a filing cabinet whose drawers were empty except for a handful of yellowed papers. The detective gestured toward the floorboards near the desk. "This is where Cole claims the struggle happened. Your father fell here. Your mother, too, when she came in. He says Harold struck them both." The sound of the storm outside drowned it all out. Ethan crouched and touched the floorboards, worn smooth over time. But in his mind he saw the chaos. The notebook scattered, his father's voice raised, the violent flash of hands, and the final silence. He swallowed hard and stood, his hands trembling. "And my brother and sister saw it. They were here." "Yes," the detective said softly. "Cole said they stood in the hallway. The children's voices, their cries, that's what forced Harold's hand. He wasn't going to leave witnesses." The words hollowed Ethan out. He pressed his palms against the desk, steadying himself as the walls seemed to close in. For 30 years, he had told himself his family had died quickly, swept away by the storm. Now, the reality was so much worse. They had died because of greed, betrayal, and cowardice. That evening, Ethan left the church and walked through town. Everywhere he went, he felt eyes on him. Some looked with pity, some with guilt, and some with fear. In the diner, conversations hushed when he walked by. Outside the drugstore, a group of older men argued about whether it was right to dig up the past. "It was 30 years ago," one said. "Why not let it lie?" Another replied, "Because we sat here all these years while an innocent family was called victims of a storm when they were victims of men we trusted." Their voices carried the tension of a town realizing its own silence had been part of the crime. That night in his motel, Ethan couldn't sleep. He spread his father's salvage journal across the desk, poring over the entries again and again. He lingered on one page where Thomas had written in bold letters, "Accountability must come, even if it costs me everything. Truth belongs not to the powerful, but to the people." Ethan read the line until his eyes blurred. His father had known the risk, had walked into the storm willingly, armed only with conviction. That knowledge cut deep, but it also gave Ethan strength. He wasn't just chasing ghosts, he was finishing what his father had begun. The trial preparations began quickly. Prosecutors interviewed Ethan for hours, piecing together his account of the night at the reservoir and the confrontation at the cliff. Cole's recorded confession was played back, his voice trembling as he recounted how Harold had insisted the children be silenced. "They were just children," Cole said on tape. "I told him we couldn't, but he said their eyes had seen too much. I carried Anna's shoe myself when we moved them years later. God forgive me." The townspeople reeled as these words were leaked to the press. Parents who had once trusted Harold to manage church funds and Cole to lead their families in prayer now had to face that those same men had buried children in shallow graves. Murmurs of anger rose at town meetings. Some demanded the church be closed permanently, its land turned into a memorial. Others clung to denial, refusing to believe their longtime pastor could have done such things. Clearwater was divided, but the truth was undeniable. Through it all, Ethan found himself visiting the cemetery at dusk. He stood before the freshly marked site where investigators had reburied the fragments of Anna and Jacob after confirming their identity through testing. A simple wooden cross marked the spot until a proper headstone could be made. "I promised I'd bring you home," he whispered one evening, kneeling in the grass. "It's not the home you deserved, but it's the truth, and I'll make sure everyone knows it." On the other side of town, Harold Briggs sat in a cell, refusing to speak except to bark curses. His trial loomed, and though his lawyers hinted at appeals and technicalities, the weight of evidence crushed his chances. Reverend Cole, meanwhile, spent his nights weeping, scrawling apologies no one wanted to read. He had chosen cowardice for 30 years, and now his repentance rang hollow. The most difficult moment came when Ethan was asked to provide a formal statement for the court record. Sitting in the sheriff's office, he spoke into the recorder. His voice broke only once, when he said, "They weren't lost in the storm. They were stolen from me by men this town trusted. My father tried to protect the truth. My mother tried to protect him. My brother and sister paid for it. For 30 years I lived thinking nature had taken them. Now I live knowing human hands did. And that truth will be the story carried forward. Not silence, not rumors, not lies." When he finished, the room was quiet. Even the sheriff, a man hardened by decades of grim cases, wiped at his eyes. Ethan left the station with the weight of grief pressing hard, but beneath it, something steadier grew. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the beginning of it. Weeks later, as he prepared to leave Clearwater, he stopped once more at the reservoir. The water had begun to fill again, rising slowly to cover the cracked bed. Soon, the lake would return to how it looked before, as if nothing had ever happened. But Ethan knew better. He stood on the bank, staring at the spot where the car had rested, and whispered, "You tried to hide them here, but the water gave them back. The storm didn't win. Time didn't win. The truth did." With that, he turned and walked away, the journal tucked firmly under his arm. His father's words, carried across decades of silence, would live on. And for the first time since he was a boy, Ethan felt that perhaps he was no longer the child left behind by a storm, but the man who had finally faced it and survived. The courthouse in Clearwater had never seen such a crowd. On the morning of Harold Briggs's arraignment, people lined the steps, some clutching umbrellas against the drizzle, others clutching old photographs of the Hales, as though holding proof that they hadn't forgotten. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and every doorway hummed with the nervous energy of a town finally being forced to confront the crime that had been hidden in plain sight for 30 years. Ethan walked slowly up those courthouse steps, his father's journal held tightly in his hand. He hadn't planned on carrying it with him, but that morning, when he tried to leave it behind at the motel, something wouldn't let him. The journal wasn't just evidence, it was his father's voice, the only thing that had survived long enough to speak the truth. Ethan kept his eyes low, ignoring the flashes, and stepped inside the courthouse, where the smell of old wood and floor polish mingled with tension thick enough to choke on. The hearing was brief but charged with emotion. Harold sat at the defendant's table, thinner now, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to meet the crowd behind him, though his jaw clenched every time the prosecutor read another charge: murder, concealment of a body, financial embezzlement, conspiracy. Reverend Cole sat at a separate table, his head bowed, his eyes hollow. He had already agreed to a plea deal in exchange for his full confession, and though his guilt was undeniable, it was Harold's presence that drew the weight of the town's hatred. When the prosecutor spoke of the night of the storm, his voice echoed through the silent room. This was no act of nature, he declared. This was premeditated violence, carried out under the cover of thunder and rain. The victims were Thomas and Margaret Hale, silenced because they dared to confront dishonesty. The children, Anna and Jacob, were silenced because they saw too much. This was not the storm. This was murder. The words struck Ethan with a force that made his chest ache. For years he had lived in the shadow of weather, blaming the elements for stealing his family. Now the storm was just a backdrop. The real storm had been in the hearts of men. When the hearing ended, the crowd spilled onto the courthouse lawn. Some shouted angrily at Harold as deputies escorted him into a waiting van. Others simply stood in stunned silence, as though only now beginning to believe what had been whispered for years. Ethan remained at the steps, watching until the van disappeared around the corner. He thought he might feel triumphant, but instead, he felt hollow, as though justice and grief were locked in a struggle inside him. Over the next few weeks, Clearwater became a town divided. For some, the arrests brought long-awaited vindication. They spoke openly about their suspicions from decades earlier, about how they'd felt uneasy with Harold's sudden wealth or Cole's long absences, but had kept silent. For others, the truth was too much to bear. They had baptized their children under Cole, trusted Harold with their tithes, and built their lives on faith in men who were now unmasked as murderers. A few left the church altogether, unable to stomach the sight of its steeple. Others clung to the idea that forgiveness was still possible, though their voices were often drowned out by anger. Ethan found himself caught between both sides, unable to rest. Reporters hounded him daily for interviews, wanting the survivor's perspective, the dramatic quotes that would sell papers. He refused most of them. His life had already been turned into a story once, when people whispered of the family lost in the storm. He didn't want to be the centerpiece of another tale, this time about corruption and murder. He wanted quiet, but the truth did not allow quiet. Late one night, unable to sleep, he drove back to the cemetery. The town was asleep, the streets dark except for the occasional glow of a porch light. At the edge of the graveyard, the grass was still damp from the rain. Ethan walked to the modest crosses marking where Anna and Jacob now rested. He knelt in the mud, resting his father's journal against the wood. "You were right," he whispered. "You told the truth, even when it cost you everything. And now the truth is finally speaking for you." His voice cracked, and for a long time he stayed there, the cool night air wrapping around him, the silence of the graveyard broken only by the sound of his own grief. The trial date was set for early spring, and preparations stretched through the winter. Prosecutors built their case around the journal, Cole's confession, and the remains recovered from the cliffside struggle. Each piece of evidence told a story that no one could deny. Ethan was called to testify, and the very thought made his stomach twist. He knew the weight of his words. He knew the eyes of the town, and the cameras beyond it, would all be on him. He wasn't sure if he had the strength to stand in that courtroom and relive the storm again. Not the storm of rain, but the storm of betrayal and violence that had stolen everything. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Ethan stayed at his parents' old property. The house had long been sold, but the new owners allowed him to walk the grounds. He stood in the yard where Anna once sat with her notebooks, where Jacob once chased fireflies. The house looked smaller than he remembered, as though time had shrunk it. Yet standing there, he could almost hear the echoes of laughter. It struck him then how much the storm had taken, not just lives but futures. His parents had been robbed of growing old together. Anna had been robbed of graduation, of marriage, of whatever life she might have built. Jacob had been robbed of boyhood itself, and he, Ethan, had been robbed of a family. One evening as he walked the property, he noticed a neighbor watching from across the fence. An elderly woman named Mrs. Redding, who had known his parents, waved him over. "Your father used to stop by here after work," she said, her voice thick with memory. "He'd sit on my porch and talk about the children, about how proud he was. He wasn't a perfect man, but he was an honest one. That's why they hated him." Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I should have spoken up when I saw things that didn't make sense. We all should have." Her words cut deep, but they also lit a fire in him. The silence of Clearwater had lasted too long, carried by too many people who had looked away. Now the silence was cracking, and though the truth hurt, it was better than another 30 years of lies. As the trial approached, Ethan sat one final time at the reservoir. The water had returned, slow and steady, covering the cracked mud where the wagon had rested. He knew in a matter of months it would look the same as it had before 2008. Calm, reflective, hiding its secrets beneath. But Ethan no longer feared the water. He no longer blamed the storm. He placed his hand against the cool surface and whispered, "You couldn't keep them hidden, you gave them back to me." The storm had been their cover, but now the storm itself seemed to have turned traitor against the guilty, spitting out the truth after 30 silent years. And Ethan knew as he stood there, the journal under his arm, that he would carry his father's fight to the end. Not because justice erased the pain, but because justice ensured that the silence which swallowed his family would never swallow anyone else's again. The trial of Harold Briggs began on a cold morning in early March. The courthouse, normally quiet, was transformed into a fortress of whispers, stares, and tension, so thick it pressed against every wall. People from Clearwater and neighboring towns packed the benches, some standing in the back hallways when the seats filled. For many, it wasn't about the law. It was about finally seeing the storm of 1979 given a face, a man to blame, a name to hold accountable. Ethan sat in the front row of the gallery, his shoulders stiff, his father's worn journal resting in his lap. He had refused to leave it at the motel. That book was more than evidence. It was the heartbeat of this case. The words of a man who had tried to protect his family with truth and had paid with his life. Each time Ethan touched the faded leather cover, he felt both strength and grief radiate from it. The prosecution opened with a timeline. How Thomas Hale had discovered missing funds from the church treasury, how he had confronted Harold and Reverend Cole, and how the storm had given them a perfect mask for violence. The prosecutor's voice rose as he described the night. The storm did not take this family. Human hands did. Harold Briggs silenced Thomas Hale, silenced Margaret Hale, and silenced the children who saw too much. He thought the thunder and rain would bury his crime forever, but the storm has spoken back, and tonight, the truth has risen. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Some townsfolk wept quietly, their faces buried in handkerchiefs. Others shook their heads, refusing to accept the words. Harold sat rigid at the defense table, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold. He wore a plain gray suit that hung too loose on his frame, but his presence carried a weight of arrogance. His attorney, a sharp man brought in from the city, argued that the evidence was too old, too broken, too circumstantial. We are asked to believe 30-year-old memories, water-damaged notes, and a confession from a broken old pastor looking to lessen his own punishment, the lawyer declared. The storm was real, and storms take lives. There is no proof Harold Briggs murdered anyone. But the evidence mounted day by day. Forensic experts testified about the station wagon pulled from the lake, pointing to dents and markings inconsistent with flood damage. The children's remains were presented with sobering detail. Their small bones matched to the Hale family through DNA, and most damning of all, Reverend Cole himself took the stand. When Cole entered, frail and bent, the courtroom held its breath. He gripped the railing, his voice quivering but steady enough to cut through the silence. "Thomas Hale was right," he began, his eyes brimming. "The money was missing. Harold took it, and I allowed it." When Thomas threatened to speak, Harold said the church would crumble, that people's faith would collapse. He was determined to silence him. I begged him to reconsider, but I was weak, too weak to stop him. His words trembled, but when he spoke of the children, the courtroom shuddered. Anna and Jacob saw. They saw everything. Harold said they would grow up and ruin us. I carried Anna when Harold, his voice broke, and he lowered his head, sobbing. I deserve to die in prison for my silence, but Harold deserves it for his violence. The gallery erupted in whispers. Ethan sat frozen, his knuckles white as he gripped his father's journal. He wanted to hate Cole, and he did, but he also saw in the man's tears the cowardice that had stolen his childhood. It wasn't just Harold who killed his family. It was silence. It was fear. When it was Ethan's turn to testify, he felt his legs heavy as stone. He stepped into the witness box, swore his oath, and sat down under the blinding lights. The prosecutor asked him about the night at the reservoir, about following Harold and Cole to the cliff, about the bag that split open and spilled the bones. Ethan answered as best he could, though his voice cracked when he described kneeling in the dirt, clutching fragments of his siblings. I promised them I'd bring them home, he said, his throat tight, and I did. The defense tried to rattle him. Isn't it true, the lawyer sneered, that grief can cloud memory, that after 30 years, you might be seeing what you want to see? Isn't it possible you misunderstood Reverend Cole's words? That the bones belonged to someone else? That the storm really was the culprit, and your anger just wants someone to blame? Ethan's jaw set, and he raised his father's journal. This isn't anger, he said, his voice ringing clear. This is truth. My father wrote their names, Harold Briggs and Reverend Cole, before he died. He wrote about the missing funds. He wrote that if anything happened to us, it would not be the storm. These are his words, his last words. And they survived 30 years in the mud because the truth refuses to stay buried. The courtroom was silent. Even the defense lawyer had no retort. For days, the trial continued. Witnesses spoke of Harold's sudden wealth in the years after 1979, of land deals and bank accounts that didn't match his salary. Others recalled odd moments, how Harold avoided speaking of the Hales, how Cole left town for months after the storm. Slowly, piece by piece, a picture formed, not of a tragic accident, but of a calculated crime carried out in shadows. When the closing arguments came, the prosecutor held up Thomas Hale's journal. This book survived when everything else did not. His voice reaches us now across 30 years. He wrote the truth then, and we honor it now. This was not the storm. This was murder. Do not let another storm of silence cover it again. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the air inside the courthouse was suffocating. Ethan sat with his hands clasped, his breath shallow, every muscle in his body tight. The foreman rose, holding the verdict slip. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Harold Briggs, guilty. Gasps and cries filled the room. Some wept with relief, others with shock. Harold sat motionless, his face white, his lips pressed into a thin line. The judge's gavel cracked against the bench, but nothing could silence the flood of emotion that swept through the courtroom. Ethan closed his eyes as tears slipped down his face. He wasn't celebrating, he wasn't triumphant, he was simply exhausted. Justice had come, but it had come 30 years too late. His parents were still gone. His siblings were still gone. Nothing could change that. But the truth, at least, had been given breath. And that was something his father had died for. That night, Clearwater was alive with murmurs and debates. Some called it justice. Others called it betrayal of old loyalties. But Ethan didn't join them. He drove out to the cemetery, his headlights cutting across the dark, and knelt by the fresh graves of Anna and Jacob. He set the journal down gently on the earth. "We did it," he whispered. "You're free now. Free from silence, free from shadows. The truth is yours again." Above him, the wind stirred through the trees, gentle this time, not storming, not raging. Just a soft rustle, as though carrying his words into the night. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt the weight of the storm begin to lift. The verdict spread through Clearwater like wildfire. By the time evening fell, the courthouse lawn was still buzzing with voices, arguments, and disbelief. Some townsfolk stood proudly saying justice had finally been served, while others whispered in bitter tones, unwilling to accept that two of the town's most respected figures had been monsters in robes. A handful refused to believe the jury at all, muttering about conspiracies and insisting the storm had been the only culprit. But most, whether they admitted it aloud or not, knew the truth had come home. The storm of 1979 had been a mask, and behind it, men they trusted had carried out a crime that would haunt Clearwater forever. Ethan left the courthouse that night quietly, slipping away while reporters swarmed the crowd for reactions. He didn't want to give them more sound bites or headlines. The trial wasn't a story to him, it was his life, carved open for everyone to see. He drove back to his motel, the hum of the old engine the only noise in the heavy silence that followed him everywhere now. When he arrived, he didn't even switch on the light. He dropped into the chair at the small desk, resting his father's journal on the wood surface, and sat with his head in his hands. For years he had wanted this moment, justice, truth, vindication for his family. But now that it had arrived, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like ashes. His parents and siblings were still gone. Their laughter wouldn't return. Their faces would never age beyond that summer of 1979. Justice was important, yes, but justice was only words on a page, a verdict read aloud in a sterile courtroom. It wasn't them. The next morning, Ethan drove out to the old Hale property. The house had been repaired and painted by the new owners, but it still looked tired, its bones heavy with history. He stood at the edge of the yard where Jacob once chased fireflies and Anna scribbled her stories in her notebook. The memories pressed against him like shadows, and he let them come, no longer afraid to feel the pain they carried. He stayed until the sun crept high, then walked back to his car. On the way into town, he stopped at the cemetery. A new headstone had been placed for Anna and Jacob, polished and carved with their names side by side. Beneath, a simple line read, "Beloved children, taken too soon, remembered always." Ethan knelt, brushing away stray leaves, his chest aching. "I thought the storm took you," he whispered. "For so long I thought it was nature, something cruel but blind. Now I know it was worse. It was people we knew. But you're home now. I brought you home." The cemetery was quiet except for the faint sound of wind moving through the trees. Ethan closed his eyes, listening. For the first time, the sound didn't feel heavy. It wasn't thunder or rain. It was gentle, almost like a sigh. He rose after a long while, feeling both weary and strangely lighter. Clearwater itself began to shift in the days after the trial. Mount Olive Church closed its doors indefinitely. Some called for it to be torn down entirely, saying its walls were stained beyond repair. Others argued for it to be rebuilt, cleansed of the sins of its leaders, and reopened as a symbol of resilience. Town meetings grew heated, with voices raised and accusations thrown, neighbors turning on one another. The storm had left wounds 30 years ago, but the truth had left scars now, deep and unavoidable. Through it all, Ethan remained on the edges. He spoke when asked, stood when called upon, but otherwise kept to himself. He wasn't interested in rebuilding the church or reshaping Clearwater's identity. His only focus was his family. He met with the county's forensic team to arrange a proper burial for his parents, whose remains from the car had finally been confirmed. Plans were made for a service where all 4 names would be honored together. It would be the funeral that had never happened in 1979, the closure that had been stolen from him. The day of the burial was gray and cool, the sky heavy with low clouds. The entire town turned out, some in guilt, some in solidarity. People lined the cemetery as the 4 coffins were lowered side by side, Thomas, Margaret, Anna, and Jacob together at last. Ethan stood at the front, his hands clasped, his heart heavy but steady. When it came time to speak, he stepped forward, holding his father's journal. "My father wrote the truth down when no one wanted to hear it," he said, his voice carrying across the rows of mourners. "He paid for that truth with his life. My mother paid for loving him. My brother and sister paid for being witnesses. For 30 years the truth was buried. But today, we lay them to rest with their names cleared. They weren't victims of a storm. They were victims of silence, of greed, of betrayal. And now the silence is broken. Now the truth belongs to them again." There wasn't a sound when he stepped back, just the soft weeping of townsfolk who had finally heard the words spoken aloud. That night, Ethan sat at the reservoir once more. The water had risen high again, the lake almost restored to the way it had been before. He stared at the surface, remembering how the car had been pulled from the mud, how the truth had risen with it. For years, he had hated this water, blamed it for swallowing his family. But now, he saw it differently. The lake hadn't kept the secret forever. In time, it had given them back. He pulled the journal from his bag and opened to the last legible entry. His father's handwriting was faded, but firm. If anything happens to us, it will not be the storm. Ethan read the line aloud into the night, his voice shaking. You were right, Dad. It wasn't the storm. It was them, but they didn't win. He closed the book, holding it against his chest, and looked up at the sky. The clouds broke just slightly, letting a thin band of stars show through. For the first time since that summer of 1979, Ethan felt a measure of peace. Not wholeness, he would never have that, but peace, fragile and real. Clearwater would argue for years about what to do with the church, about how to remember the Hales, about how to forgive themselves for looking away. But for Ethan, the path was clear. He would carry his father's words, his family's memory, and he would never let silence bury them again. The storm had once hidden everything, but the storm was gone now, and only the truth remained. The weeks that followed the Hale family's burial marked the slow settling of a town that had been shaken to its very foundation. Clearwater, once a place where people spoke of the storm of '79 in hushed tones, now carried the story on its shoulders out loud. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades began to face one another with new honesty. Some offered apologies to Ethan, admitting they had turned away when his father raised questions about the church. Others could not bring themselves to say a word. Their shame, too heavy. Their silence, another kind of confession. Ethan stayed longer than he had planned. At first, it was to help the sheriff's office sort through the mountain of evidence, then to attend community meetings where townsfolk argued about what to do with Mount Olive Church. One group demanded it be demolished, calling it cursed ground, soaked with betrayal. Another said it should be rebuilt as a memorial, a living testament to the Hale family and to truth that had finally risen after decades. Ethan listened quietly, but when pressed for his opinion, he gave only one answer. Whatever you do, don't let it be forgotten. Don't let silence return. He visited the cemetery often, sitting at the row where his family now lay together. Sometimes he spoke aloud, telling them about the trial, about the people who had stood up for them, about the ones still clinging to denial. Other times he sat in silence, just letting the weight of 30 years slowly lift from his shoulders. He no longer felt like the boy left behind. He felt like the man who had carried his family's truth out of the storm. Clearwater began to heal, though healing was messy. Attendance at church services across town dropped sharply. Some said their faith had been broken beyond repair. Others clung tighter, saying faith wasn't the enemy, but the people who twisted it. The town struggled to define itself anew. But perhaps struggle was a kind of progress. For Ethan, closure came in unexpected moments. One afternoon, he sat in the diner where he had first seen Harold and Reverend Cole whispering in the booth. The same waitress, Linda, poured his coffee and said softly, "Your father would be proud." He nodded, unable to speak for a long while. But those words warmed something in him that had been frozen since 1979. Another day, he walked along the banks of the reservoir. The water had risen almost to its old height, erasing the cracked earth and the scars left by draining. But Ethan no longer feared it. He no longer saw it as a grave. He saw it as a witness, one that had held the truth in silence until it could finally release it. Standing at the water's edge, he whispered, "Thank you." Eventually, Ethan packed his things and prepared to leave Clearwater. He wasn't sure if he would return. The town held too much pain, too many ghosts. But it also held something new, the truth, alive at last. Before leaving, he placed his father's journal in the hands of the Historical Society with one request. Don't let it gather dust. Let people read it. Let them know what happened here. Let my family's voices never go silent again. On his last night in town, Ethan returned to the cemetery. The air was cool, the sky clear, and the stars brighter than he had seen in years. He placed a single lantern on the ground before the graves and spoke softly. "It took 30 years, but I brought you justice. I carried your truth. I won't stop carrying it. Wherever I go, you'll go too." He lingered there, watching the light flicker against the stones, until the chill drove him away. As he drove out of Clearwater the next morning, he glanced once in the rearview mirror. The town shrank behind him, the church steeples small against the horizon, the reservoir glinting under the early sun. For the first time, he didn't feel the ache of unfinished business. The storm was finally over. And though grief never left, something else had taken root in its place. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of truth. The Hale family story reminds us that silence can be as dangerous as the storm itself. For decades, their disappearance was blamed on weather, on fate, on tragedy. But the truth was darker, and it took nearly 30 years for it to rise from the mud. In the end, justice came, not swiftly, not easily, but it came. If you've watched this far, thank you for staying with me through this haunting story. What do you think? Should Clearwater rebuild the church as a memorial, or should it be torn down forever? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories of hidden truths, long-buried mysteries, and justice that refuses